By the end of that month, I'd lost a job offer I never should have lost, discovered my own company had been quietly monitoring my job search for weeks, and learned that the person behind it wasn't who I would have guessed if you'd asked me to name a single suspect anywhere in that building on that particular day. It started with an email that read, in full. After further consideration, we've decided to move forward with another candidate. No explanation, no specific feedback, just a door closing on something I'd worked toward for 8 months, 3 rounds of interviews, and a final offer letter that had already listed my new salary in writing. I think about that particular afternoon often, the specific quality of light coming through my kitchen window, the way my phone buzzed once more with an unrelated grocery delivery notification just minutes after the rejection email, the world continuing on in small, ordinary ways, while something much larger quietly rearranged itself underneath. I want to walk you through exactly how I found out what actually happened, because the shape of it surprised me more than almost anything else in my entire professional life, and I need you to stay with me to see where it actually leads. It's not the story I expected to be telling when I first opened that rejection email, certain it had to be some ordinary hiring mistake I'd never fully understand, the kind of quiet disappointment you eventually stop turning over in your head, simply because there's nothing left to examine. My name is Marceline. I was 33, a senior project manager at a regional engineering firm, 6 years into a role that had, over time, quietly expanded to include far more responsibility than my title reflected. I managed timelines across 4 active infrastructure contracts, coordinated with regulators on permitting issues nobody else on the team fully understood, and had become, without any formal recognition of it, the single point of continuity for institutional knowledge that would have taken a replacement the better part of a year to rebuild from scratch. I'd been quietly job searching for 8 months, not out of any dramatic dissatisfaction, but because I'd hit a ceiling in both title and compensation that 2 separate conversations with leadership hadn't managed to move. I kept the search entirely private, no posts, no mentions to coworkers, interviews scheduled around lunch breaks, and the occasional half-day off I described vaguely as personal errands, a small, ordinary deception I never once felt guilty about until someone decided to punish me for it anyway. My direct manager, a woman named Corliss, ran our department with a precision that some people found intimidating. She wasn't the type to remember your coffee order or ask about your weekend plans. Meetings with her stayed on task, feedback was delivered plainly, and praise, when it came, was specific and infrequent enough that you actually trusted it meant something. I respected her. I also, if I'm being direct about it, found her difficult to read, which is a very different thing from finding her untrustworthy. I remember a performance review, roughly a year before any of this happened, where I'd asked her directly about a path toward director-level responsibilities. She hadn't offered false reassurance the way some managers might have. She told me, plainly, that the title structure above me was largely fixed for the foreseeable future, that she'd raised it with leadership without much traction, and that if advancement mattered enough to me, I might need to look beyond our company to find it. I remember appreciating that answer at the time, even though it wasn't the one I wanted, because it felt like the truth, rather than a comfortable deflection. I think, looking back, that conversation is part of why my suspicion eventually landed on her so easily. She was the one person who'd ever told me plainly that leaving might be my best option, and once things went wrong, that plainness curdled, in my head, into something that felt like it might have been a warning she'd quietly acted on herself. The offer came through in my 8th month of searching, a director-level role at a competing firm, a meaningful salary increase, and a start date 6 weeks out. I hadn't told anyone at my current job. I planned to resign the same week the formal offer letter arrived, cleanly, on my own terms. The rescission email arrived 4 days before my planned resignation, from the hiring manager at the new company, a woman I'd built what felt like genuine rapport with across 3 rounds of interviews. I called her immediately, and she was clearly uncomfortable on the phone, choosing her words with a care that told me more than the words themselves did. I could hear background noise on her end, an open office, someone laughing somewhere behind her, the ordinary sounds of a workday continuing on exactly as it always did, indifferent to the fact that mine had just quietly come apart. I want to be careful about what I say, she told me. This came from above my level. I pushed back on it. I lost that particular fight. Can you tell me anything? I asked. About what changed? I can tell you it wasn't about your interviews, she said. Everyone on our side wanted to move forward with you. I can also tell you our HR team received some kind of reference contact they weren't expecting, and after that, the decision came down from someone above me to pull the offer. I'm sorry. I wish I could give you more than that. Her voice caught slightly on that last sentence, and I remember believing her immediately, in a way I didn't quite believe the original rejection email at all. Rejections written by committee rarely sound like they cost the person delivering them anything. Hers clearly had. I hadn't listed my current employer as a reference. I'd been careful about that specifically, for exactly the reason most people job searching quietly are careful about it. I didn't want anyone at my current company to know I was leaving before I chose to tell them myself. I'd even avoided using my work laptop for anything related to the search, scheduling interviews on a personal calendar app instead, precisely to keep that separation as clean as I could manage, while still working a full schedule at my current job. I sat with that phone call for a full day before I let myself act on the suspicion sitting underneath it. If nobody had listed my current company as a reference, and someone from my current company had contacted the new employer anyway, that meant someone there had gone looking for information they had no legitimate reason to have. I remember pacing my apartment that entire evening, running through every possible innocent explanation I could think of, and finding, each time, that none of them actually held together once I looked at them closely. I reached out to a coworker in IT, a careful, quiet man named Petra, who I'd worked alongside for years on system access issues related to our project management software. I didn't tell him everything at first, only that I suspected someone had been checking into my activity outside normal work channels, and asked whether that was something our systems could even show. Depends what you mean, he said. If you're asking whether anyone can see your personal email or your phone, no, not through anything we manage here. If you're asking whether anyone can see your calendar, your badge access logs, or your work email, that's a different question. A fair number of people technically have visibility into those things, even if they're not supposed to look without a reason. He said it plainly, without much alarm in his voice yet, the way someone describes a technical fact, rather than something they suspect has already gone wrong. I asked him to check, carefully, whether my calendar or badge logs had been accessed recently by anyone outside my own team. It took him a few days, working within what he was authorized to pull without raising flags of his own, but eventually he came back with something specific. My calendar had been accessed 11 times over the preceding 6 weeks by an account belonging to someone in our HR department, well beyond what any routine HR function would require for an employee not currently under any kind of formal review. I want to be clear about what I'm showing you, Petra said, sliding his laptop across the table between us. This isn't a guess. This is a system log. Somebody with HR-level access looked at your calendar 11 separate times over 6 weeks, and none of those views line up with anything in your file that would explain routine HR involvement. The account belonged to a man named Ambrose, our VP of People, someone I'd interacted with maybe a dozen times over 6 years, mostly at company-wide events, pleasant enough in passing but never someone I'd worked with closely enough to have any real read on. I want to be plain that this wasn't, on its own, an unreasonable thing for a company to look into if there had been a legitimate reason for it. What made it feel wrong wasn't the fact of the access itself. It was the complete absence of any legitimate reason attached to it anywhere in my file. No note, no flag, no formal review that would have justified that level of attention from someone I barely knew. I want to walk you through who I actually suspected before Ambrose's name ever came up, because it wasn't him. I assumed, almost immediately, that it had to be Corliss. She managed my calendar approvals directly. She'd have noticed the pattern of unexplained half-days more readily than almost anyone else in the building, and her precise, controlled manner had always left me slightly uncertain about how she'd react if she ever suspected I was planning to leave. I spent nearly a week building a case against her in my head, replaying every slightly clipped interaction from the preceding months, searching for confirmation in tone and timing that, in hindsight, I was mostly inventing out of anxiety rather than evidence. I finally asked Petra directly whether Corliss's account showed up anywhere in the access logs he'd pulled. It didn't. Not once. Across the entire 6-week window. I know it's tempting to land on the person closest to you, Petra said, when I told him where my thinking had gone. But the logs don't lie the way a hunch can. Corliss never touched your calendar outside normal approval workflows. Whatever this is, it's coming from somewhere else. I sat with that correction longer than I expected to need. It's a strange, specific discomfort, realizing you've spent a week quietly building a case against someone based on nothing but tone and your own fear, while the actual evidence was pointing somewhere you hadn't thought to look at all. I actually rehearsed, more than once that week, a version of a conversation where I confronted Corliss directly, imagining her reaction, imagining how she'd defend herself. I'm grateful, looking back, that I never had that conversation with her, because it would have cost something real between us, over a suspicion that had nothing solid underneath it at all. Petra and I spent the following 2 weeks piecing together why a VP of people with no direct working relationship with me would have any reason to sabotage a job offer I hadn't even told my own manager about yet. The answer, once we found it, had almost nothing to do with me personally, and everything to do with a funding round our company was in the final stages of closing. Petra's contact in finance mentioned, in an unrelated conversation, that the company's valuation model for the round leaned heavily on projected retention rates among senior technical and project staff, a metric investors had specifically flagged as a risk area during due diligence, given 2 recent departures earlier that year that had already rattled confidence in the leadership team's stability. Ambrose, it turned out, had direct incentive compensation tied to retention metrics hitting a specific threshold before the round closed, a bonus structure Petra's contact confirmed existed, though the exact figures stayed out of reach for either of us. My departure, quiet as it would have been, represented one more senior technical resignation, in a year that already had 2, at the exact moment investors were scrutinizing that specific number most closely. I hadn't known, before any of this, that a single line item in a compensation plan could end up mattering more to someone than an actual working relationship ever had. He hadn't needed to know me personally to have every reason to stop my resignation. He'd simply needed to know I was leaving, monitor my calendar closely enough to notice the pattern of interviews, and make one quiet, unauthorized phone call to a hiring manager at a company I'd never listed him as any kind of contact for, using language vague enough to tank an offer, without ever putting anything in writing that could later be traced back to him directly. Petra sat with that explanation for a while before saying anything, turning his coffee cup slowly on the table between us. "It's almost worse than if he'd had something personal against you," he said finally. "At least that would make some kind of sense. This is just arithmetic. You were a number that threatened another number he needed to hit, and he handled it the same way he'd probably handle a budget line that was running slightly over." I didn't have a response to that right away, sitting with the idea that an entire year of my life, a real offer, a real salary, a real start date, had been quietly erased over a spreadsheet line, took longer to settle than I expected it to. We needed something more concrete than a retention bonus and access logs before taking this anywhere formal. Petra suggested reaching back out to the hiring manager at the company that had rescinded my offer, this time asking a more specific question than I had the first time we spoke. I called her again, and this time asked directly whether she could tell me the name of the person who had contacted her HR team, even if she couldn't share the full content of what was said. She hesitated for a long moment. "I probably shouldn't," she said. "But given how this affected you, and given that it clearly wasn't a legitimate reference check, I'll tell you this much. The email came from a personal address, not a company one, and it was signed with a first name only, Ambrose. I remember it because it struck our HR lead as unusual at the time, an anonymous-sounding contact making claims about your reliability that didn't match anything in your actual interview record. I asked her whether she still had any part of that original message, even a forwarded copy, or a screenshot, anything that might exist beyond her own memory of it. She said she'd check, cautiously, since she wasn't sure what her own company's policy allowed her to share, and a few days later she sent over a short, redacted summary her HR lead had kept in an internal note, enough to confirm the sender's name and the general nature of the claims, without exposing anything beyond what she felt comfortable sharing given her own obligations. That confirmation, paired with the calendar access logs, gave us something concrete enough to act on rather than simply theorize about. I sat with everything Petra and I had found for several days before deciding how to move forward, and I want to walk you through the version of this I almost chose instead. Part of me wanted to email Ambrose directly, calmly, and simply ask him outright why he'd contacted a company I'd never listed him as a reference for. I wanted to watch him try to explain a personal email account and a first-name-only signature to a hiring manager who'd already flagged the contact as unusual. Petra talked me out of a direct approach. "The moment he knows you're aware of this," he said, "he has every reason to delete whatever's left of that personal email thread and simply deny the whole thing ever happened. Right now you have access logs and a second-hand account from the hiring manager. A direct confrontation gives him time to make both of those things harder to prove. So instead, we built a clear, dated timeline, the calendar access pattern, the retention bonus structure Petra's contact had confirmed existed, and a written statement from the hiring manager describing the anonymous contact, which she agreed to provide once she understood the full scope of what had happened to me, and I requested a meeting, not with Ambrose, and not with Corliss, but with our CEO directly, a measured man named Osric who I'd interacted with rarely, but who had a reputation across the company for taking data over office politics whenever the two came into conflict. Osric read through everything in near silence for close to 20 minutes, while I sat across from him saying very little, letting the documentation carry the weight of the explanation. "Walk me through this calendar access again," he said finally, tapping the log Petra had pulled. "You're telling me Ambrose accessed your calendar 11 times over 6 weeks, with no formal review process attached to your file that would explain that kind of attention." "That's what the logs show," I said. "And the hiring manager at the company that rescinded my offer confirmed an anonymous contact from a personal email, signed only with his first name, making claims about my reliability that don't match anything in my actual performance record here." He was quiet for a long moment, the specific quiet of someone recalculating a number he'd likely reviewed and approved, without ever questioning what sat underneath it. "And this retention bonus structure," he said, sliding the compensation documentation toward the center of the table, "directly incentivizes preventing exactly the kind of departure you were planning." "I'm telling you what the documentation shows," I said. "I'll let you draw your own conclusions about the rest." He was quiet again before speaking. "I want to be plain with you," he said. "I approved that retention bonus structure myself, without asking enough questions about what it might incentivize someone to do outside normal channels. That's on me as much as it's on him. I'm going to need everything you have, formally, and I'm going to need legal, and our board's audit committee looped in before this goes any further, given the timing relative to our funding round." He paused, then asked me one more question before the meeting ended. "Why come to me directly, rather than through HR's normal channel?" "Because Ambrose runs that channel," I said. "I didn't have a version of this that ended anywhere useful if it went through his own department first." Osric nodded slowly, the specific nod of someone filing that answer away as its own separate piece of evidence about how thoroughly this had been allowed to operate unchecked. Osric moved quickly once he understood the full shape of what he was looking at. Within days, Ambrose was placed on administrative leave, and an internal review was launched examining whether his personal email account had been used to contact other companies regarding other employees who may have quietly interviewed elsewhere over the preceding year. That review, once completed, found 2 additional instances following a similar pattern. Employees whose exit interviews later revealed unexplained, last-minute complications with competing offers that neither of them had ever fully understood at the time. Neither of those 2 people had pushed the question the way I eventually did, and both had simply stayed at the company, never learning why an opportunity they'd been excited about had quietly fallen apart. One of them, a structural engineer named Percy who I'd worked alongside on 2 separate contracts, found out about all of this secondhand, weeks after the review concluded, and stopped by my desk one afternoon, looking somewhere between grateful and unsettled. "I spent almost a year thinking I'd just imagined the whole thing going wrong," he told me. "Told myself the other company must have found someone better, that it wasn't personal. I never once thought to ask who else might have gotten a call I never knew about." I didn't have anything especially comforting to offer him beyond agreeing that the not knowing was its own particular kind of damage, separate from whatever the original sabotage had cost him. My own former hiring manager reached back out once the situation became clear, and though the original role had since been filled, she offered to keep me in mind for a similar position opening the following quarter, an offer I accepted, this time with a start date that arrived without incident. I didn't get to watch the meeting where Ambrose was formally terminated, and I didn't especially need to. What I needed was the truth landing in front of someone, with the standing to act on it, and the two other employees, quietly notified afterward, finally understanding what had actually happened to opportunities they'd assumed had simply fallen through on their own. If you've ever had an opportunity quietly fall apart with no real explanation, only to wonder for months afterward what actually happened, tell me about it in the comments. I read every single one, and if stories like this matter to you, subscribe, because there's more coming. I think most about how close I came to spending that entire investigation, looking in exactly the wrong direction, certain the answer had to be the person whose manner I found hardest to read, rather than the person whose manner I'd never had reason to question at all. Corliss and I are direct colleagues to this day, and I've come to trust her more, not less, in the aftermath of nearly building an entire case against her, out of nothing but a controlled voice and my own uncertainty. Ambrose, by contrast, was pleasant in exactly the way that never once made me suspicious of him, which I've come to understand isn't a contradiction at all. It's simply how it usually works. The people worth watching closely aren't always the ones who make you uneasy. Sometimes they're just the ones nobody ever thinks to watch, because ease itself has a way of standing in for trust, even when the two have nothing to do with each other. I started a new role 3 months later, at the company that had originally rescinded my offer, and on my first morning there, the hiring manager who'd fought to bring me back stopped by my desk just to say she was glad this particular ending had finally arrived. I told her the truth, which was that I was glad too, though some part of me still finds myself checking, every so often, exactly who has access to what on my calendar these days. Old habits like that take longer to unlearn than the situation that created them.